These amendments respond to one of the most worrying and objectionable aspects of the bill. As currently worded, and as you mentioned when discussing the last amendment, Minister, the bill is designed to interfere only in instances of manifestly inappropriate burials. This means that even though a young woman or child may have died in unnatural, unknown or suspicious circumstances, that is not in itself a reason for an intervention. This bill, as my previous amendments outline, always requires inappropriate burials, and there is an extensive definition of what constitutes such. Suspicious or unnatural deaths or deaths in unknown instances are not enough to warrant an intervention, and this is simply wrong. Several recommendations in the committee's pre-legislative scrutiny report support this, including number 5. I'll quote it: any burial site where the circumstances surrounding the death and or body disposal method warrant an investigation as to their lawfulness. And number 6, that intervention should give due consideration to suspicious or unlawful deaths, as well as the existence of inappropriate burials. The bill currently ignores these recommendations and the extensive evidence on which they are based. Several witnesses highlighted that international human rights and traditional justice standards should be adopted. They found the general scheme of the bill to be lacking in this regard. And unfortunately, the current bill is also failing to meet these standards. The Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission and the Irish Council of Civil Liberties recommended use of the UN Special Rapporteur's definition of mass grave sites, including any burial site where the circumstances surrounding the death and or body disposal method warrant an investigation as to their lawfulness. Similarly, the Adoption Rights Alliance noted the current imbalance in the bill with intervention based on existence of inappropriate burials rather than suspicious or unlawful deaths. Witnesses such as representatives from the Tuam Home Survivor Network and Guernica Group pointed out that we know about practices of neglect, malnutrition and malpractice in institutions. All deaths associated with these homes are already suspicious and need to be investigated. My amendments have attempted to address the concerns of witnesses by including unnatural death or death by unknown causes as a standalone reason to intervene at a site. I've drawn on language from the Coroners Act in this regard. Minister, are you supportive of the broader principle rather than specific wording? If that's the case, I'd consider withdrawing the amendment if you commit to changing the criteria for intervention to include suspicious or unnatural death as a standalone rationale. This bill has to align with international human rights and traditional justice standards.
Is there any other deputies offering in this group of amendments before I return to the Minister?
Speak on 52, if that's okay, Chair.
Yep,
this amendment, after filing, seeks to insert accidental, homicide, undetermined or suspicious death. And this amendment seeks to expand the criteria in this section in which An Garda Síochána is alerted to evidence of human remains. The current requirements are too limited, and there is a real possibility that some deaths may not be adequately examined if such a death was to occur now.
Thanks, Deputy. Any other deputies before return? Minister?
Thanks very much, Chair. The purpose of this legislation is to provide, as we know, for the excavation, recovery, analysis, identification and the dignified reburial of human remains buried in a manifestly inappropriate manner. And this is the legislative gap that the bill seeks to fill so that these interventions can take place at Tuam and at any other site where similar circumstances come to light. It's for that reason I'm not in a position to accept this group of amendments. Amendments 6 and 16, as well as number 78, they seek to alter the definition of principal burial land and the condition for making the government order so that an intervention can take place which does not relate to burials which are manifestly inappropriate, but rather relates to burials of persons whose deaths may have occurred in a violent or unnatural manner or suddenly and of unknown causes. Amendment 38 seeks to alter the function of the director so that he or she would have to arrange for forensic excavation and recovery of human remains where death would have occurred in a violent or unnatural manner or suddenly or from unknown causes. And this approach would fundamentally alter the scope of the bill and ultimately would change the underlying rationale of this piece of legislation. There are a number of difficulties with what are proposed. Firstly, these amendments would represent a strong interference with the jurisdiction of An Garda Síochána and the coroner. Any intervention and investigation in relation to violent or unnatural death should clearly come under the remit of those two bodies. This is why the bill rightly provides upfront that an order may not be made if an investigation or inquest is already underway and the Garda Commissioner is of the view that it would be premature to make an order for intervention pending the outcome of the investigation. Similarly, the bill rightly provides that where an intervention under this legislation is underway, the director of the agency must notify both An Garda Síochána and the coroner of any evidence of violent or unnatural death which comes to light during the intervention, and then follow their directions in terms of what the director should do next. Moreover, it's unclear how, within this specific legislation, it would be established prior to intervention that a death occurred in a violent, unnatural or sudden and unknown manner. And I've stated before, this legislation is seeking to complement existing law, including the Coroner's Act. It's not seeking to replace it. It's not seeking to set up a new system. And when we moved from the general scheme to this full draft, we made a major change in terms of we removed all the restrictions on the jurisdiction of the coroner, and that was significant. And furthermore, under this legislation, the director will have to try to identify the circumstances and causes of death of recovered remains, and if evidence of violent or unnatural death emerges, the director must then notify the coroner and An Garda Síochána immediately. In terms of the Amendment 54 brought forward by Deputy Ward, 52. 52, that is concerned with changing the description of the type of death that must be notified to the coroner and a member of Garda Síochána. What I can say is that the current wording of violent or unnatural would encompass any suspicious deaths where there is potential evidence of same, including homicide. And I think in practical terms, it is important that the language we used in the legislation here is aligned with the basis of exhumation in the Coroner's Act. And more broadly, the director under this legislation will publish a full post-recovery analysis report in respect of all recovered remains and will ensure that it is brought to the attention of the relevant coroner. And for that reason, I can't particularly support that amendment, but I do believe that the vast majority of what is encompassed in Amendment 52 is already covered within the text of the legislation.
Deputy Cairns.
Yeah, and the Minister is saying that it would alter the scope of the bill. That's precisely why we've put in these amendments, because the scope of the bill is to blatantly really only intervene at potentially Tuam. And I think that, you know, the entire nation thinks that there should be intervention where there's suspicious or unlawful death. So absolutely, we are trying to change the scope of the bill because it's very narrowly framed. And you saying, oh, well, then that might, you know, restrict Gardaí or the coroner in terms of what they're doing. This is an age-old problem, and the guards and the coroner haven't intervened. I agree with you that that should have happened a long, long time ago, but it hasn't. And here we are making legislation for something that we never should have needed. The guards should have intervened, the coroner should have intervened, all of this should have been dealt with, but it hasn't been. So that's why we want to include it in the bill, precisely.
Minister.
During the course of the debate in the PLS, we kind of went back and forth on this in terms of where jurisdictions begin and end. And at that time, we had been concerned to, I suppose, draw a clear distinction between the actions of this agency and the actions of the coroner. And I think at that time there was a fear that that was an attempt to limit the coroner's role, and in particular perhaps undermine the scope for potential investigations. And we sought to address that, and I think we have been able to address that within the context of this legislation. But the agency being established here is an agency designed to deal with situations of manifestly inappropriate burials. That is what we're trying. That is what the goal is to create here, and create the infrastructure, the legal infrastructure around that, to deal with the incredibly complex situation of both the excavation, the recovery, that very detailed post-recovery analysis, the DINA identification, and finally the respectful reburial of remains. And to try and create an agency that on top of that is also trying to undertake, I suppose, investigative functions in terms of moving into the role of the coroner, moving into the role of An Garda Síochána. I don't believe that's wise. I think it, in ways, goes against the tenor of what we were discussing earlier on, in that those, the An Garda Síochána, the coroner, have their set roles and set ambits. The role of this agency is to deal with situations of manifestly inappropriate burial, be it in Tuam or be it in other areas, and that's why the extensive scope has been given there. We've made changes to ensure that nothing in creating this agency interferes with the role of the coroner, but I don't think it's wise to go further in terms of giving those sort of investigative powers to this agency. That's not what it's designed to do.
Any other deputies? Okay, so Amendment 6, which has already been moved. So how stands the amendment? Is the amendment being withdrawn or pressed? Okay, on Amendment number 6, the question is that the amendment be made. Those in favour say Tá.
Tá.
Those against say Níl. I think the question is lost.
Vote all.
Vote all. On Amendment 6, that the amendment be made, and on that question a division has been challenged, so the division will now be taken by the clerk.
Deputy Backich. Deputy Cairns. Deputy Costello. Deputy Crowe. Deputy Dillon. Deputy Funchen.
Tá.
Deputy Phelan. And Deputy Ward.
So the result of the division is Tá 4, Níl 5, and the question is lost.